All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight's joint housing workshop. Bear with us while we deal with the heat. I know it's a little warm in here, so if you need to position yourself in front of a fan, please do so. My name is Kate Hosier. I'm the city manager for the city of South Haven, and I wanted to just kind of get through a few housekeeping items. We have some restrooms in this back hallway here, right over here. There's some agendas on that table back there by Mr. Schooley. We do have the air on, so it should be getting progressively colder, but we'll see how this is going. I did want to let everyone know that we'll have Mayor Smith to come up and give some remarks, and then Supervisor Stein will come up and give some remarks, and then we'll go into the presentation by Ryan Kilpatrick. Following the presentation, we'll have a Q&A period. There will be 2 minutes for questions posed based on items in the presentation. And we are recording this session, so if you can, use the microphone next to Mr. Kilpatrick. Ryan, can you raise your hand to see where that microphone is? Thank you. That way we can record all the comments. With that being said, I'll introduce Mayor Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. We'll try to be efficient because there's a band concert at the end, right, Mr. Schooley? If we hurry quickly, he's talking back there. Hey, what time is the band concert? 7 o'clock. Might be quick. Okay, so good evening, everybody. I just want to say welcome. We have City Council here. I know we have planning folks. We have the Township Board is here. So welcome. Welcome, Ryan, who's an outstanding presenter and great information on housing. So really, this is a chance for us to discuss a common problem. We all know it's a problem. It's a problem not in our city, not just in our state, but in our country. We have a lack of housing supply. Prices are up. Costs are up for building supplies. We all know all the variables. Nothing's really new in that regard. So the question really of these two bodies and of this community is there an interest in coming up with some common solutions? So I think that's our challenge tonight. I would say as a city, we're curious to learn about the township's issues, challenges. What are you looking to do? Because we know we have our challenges. We've got a whole lot of demand for homes, whether it be primary residence, secondary residence. We've got this beautiful lake, and as everybody knows, we always say it's like the blessing and the curse of the lake, because as long as there's water in that lake, and Chicago's 2 hours away, there's going to be a demand for homes in our community. That's the way it is. But we want to obviously still maintain our community as it is. We want to, continue to grow and thrive. So I hope tonight we can at least agree that we already work together. We work together as South Haven Public Schools, SHASA, SHARA, police and fire. Our communities already work together, and we will continue to work together. We should. We have a lot of common challenges, so we should be working together. So let's have a dialogue, listen to one another, and I look forward to having further dialogue as this goes through. So I know who do I have? Steve Schlock, City Council is here. Step away, George Schleiper is here. Jeff Arnold's here. Joe Reeser's here. Anybody else? Everyone else is off enjoying a nice night, which is good. So anyway, welcome. Let's bring up some good ideas. Welcome to all the public folks, too, for coming tonight. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And now, Mr. Ross Stein, who is an outstanding individual and an ambassador for the whole area, I'll let him take over. So again, thanks, everybody, for coming. Look forward to hearing.
Well, I don't have anything prepared. I would like to add to Scott, our South Haven Township Planning Commission is here also, so kudos to that. When the water sewer agreement was reached 20-some years ago, the township gave up the industrial side of things. Will the city take care of that because there's things that cities can do that townships our size can't do? We said we'd survive on residential and we'd survive on commercial. The township has land that's available for residential building. There's some properties out there that are for sale. There's some other properties that we're looking at that may be developed for senior housing. We're looking for housing for the people trying to come in. I think the high-end housing takes care of itself, but we need everything for anybody that wants to work here, because I don't think there's probably a business in town that doesn't have a help wanted sign, and we got to figure out how to address that issue. So that's way beyond my scope of trying to figure that out. That's why we brought Ryan tonight, and hopefully Ryan will give us some insight on the demands, hopefully some funding mechanisms. Everybody knows that the federal government's just throwing money out. Hopefully we can get some of that money to help get some affordable homes going in. The state legislature, state government passed some legislation a little bit ago to try to get some affordable housing. They're recognizing the need for it. So I'm not smart enough to say, do we need apartments? Do we need townhouses? Do we need single family homes? I think we need all of that. So we're here to learn, and we'll hopefully get some experience from Ryan tonight and know where we're going to be moving forward. So with that, I think Kate's got some introduction for Ryan, so thank you.
All right, thanks, folks. We're gonna bring Ryan Kilpatrick up here. Here's the main reason we wanted to bring you guys in here today. Ryan Kilpatrick is well known for leading Housing Next, and prior to Housing Next, he worked for the MEDC, where he was the lead project manager for West Michigan. In that role, Ryan helped to close more than $450 million worth of private investment across the region and negotiated the use of state tools to support nearly 50 projects. Well-known subject matter expert, we'd like to bring him in here and kind of learn what we can do. So this is an informational meeting to kick off a community conversation. Here you go, Ryan.
Good evening. Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Is that fine? Yeah, good. Thank you. Thanks for having me back. I know I've come and talked with this community a couple of times in the past, and it's always nice to come back down. So I think the stage has been pretty well set. I'm going to dive right into what we're going to talk about tonight. Which frankly is the issue, as Mayor Smith referred to, is our lack of housing generally. So when I've been working for Housing Next, and I'm also working for some other communities across West Michigan, in a majority of our communities, what we're facing is a scarcity of housing supply in communities where we have either a growing population or a transitioning population. And so it's a mismatch between the housing supply that we have and what people need or can afford in that same community. But the other thing that we often find is there's a disparity between who has access to that housing and how readily available it is. And then lastly, it's really understanding where and how are we seeing dramatic price increases. One of the things I'm noticing, which is no shocker to you all, is there is a dramatic price increase the closer you get to the lakeshore and the closer you get to downtown South Haven. There is a less dramatic and yet still significant price increase happening across all of Van Buren County, especially in the northwest corner of the county. So it's really thinking about how did we get here? And it's the result of 3 intersecting shortages. And those shortages roughly relate here to land availability and what you can do with the land. The labor that's necessary to build housing supply. When we have a shortage of labor, the cost goes up in order to employ the labor. And then we also have a shortage of income in terms of our workers' wages. A majority of our workers, roughly 60% of our workers in the state of Michigan, are still earning less than $20 an hour. Now that's changed a little bit over the course of the pandemic. Due to the labor shortage, we've got some employers that are paying more on an hourly basis. But we're still noticing that the cost of living is increasing quite a bit faster than the inflation of wages. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of the biggest ones is that many of our lower wage jobs are either service jobs or manufacturing jobs that are in competition with technology and with an international labor force. So what I want to do here is set the stage and be clear about the fact that wages are an issue, but also acknowledge that we can't control globalism at the local level. We can't control international labor forces and trade agreements. Those things don't get solved in these kind of meeting rooms. So it's an important thing to keep on the table, but it's not something we can address here locally. So one of the really important things that I think we need to recognize as we look at our housing stock and availability is who's entering the housing market and what are the choices that they're trying to select and how do their choices impact the rest of the market. So this is actually data from Kent County, but it doesn't matter what the data says. What matters is how it works in the system. So what I want you to do is look at across the top, it says rental housing gap estimates by AMI. AMI means area median income. That's your average income in the community. And then below that, we have a series of percentages, and that's 0 to 30% of the area median income. Those are your lowest income households, all the way up to 120% of your area median income. So in Van Buren County, your area median income is about $58,000 a year for a single adult and about $68,000 a year for a family of 4. So you can do the math. You can figure out what 30% of that would be or what 120% of that would be. But what I want you to pay close attention to is what's happening here with these numbers. Look at that 80 to 120% area median income range. That's our largest gap when you look at overall units needed at the bottom and move over across the columns. You see 1,469 units needed. And then above that, you see you've got 979 units needed in the 120% AMI category. Now I'm going to click this once. The way that those arrows are moving, this is called a step-down effect. So I wish I could walk the microphone over and tell you about this, but I'll do my best from here. What's happening here in that 120% AMI category, you see all the way over on the right, middle of the table, you see negative 1,113. Everybody see that number? Okay. That is a critical number, and it's happening in every housing market across the country right now. It's a different number, but it's doing the same thing. Our highest income earners don't spend 30% of their income on housing. What they do is they step down in the marketplace. At least half of that market segment steps down. They say, why would I spend 30% of my income on housing? Why would I spend $1,500 a month in rent when there's another product in the same neighborhood that's $900 a month in rent? I'm gonna choose the $900 a month rent. But what they're then doing is competing with those middle-class wage earners for a scarce amount of middle-class apartments or a scarce amount of middle-class homes. So the same thing happens in both the rental market and the for-sale market. You may earn $150,000 a year and still decide, I really don't want to pay more than $250,000 for a house. And you have the luxury as a higher income earner of going into a particular market and competing for all of the houses that are worth $250,000. And you also have the luxury of being able to offer more than asking price, right? So we're seeing this all over the state right now. Listings for homes that are priced between $150,000 and $250,000 tend to be sold in 2 weeks or less across most of the state of Michigan. And it's because that's a really valuable price point. But it's our highest income earners that are still buying a majority of those homes. It's not very many middle-class home buyers because they can't compete. What they can't do is offer more than asking price or make all cash offers or waive inspections. Has anybody heard of people waiving inspections right now, right? To me, that seems crazy. But when you're desperate, you do things like that. So then what happens is you look at units in the pipeline that I've now outlined in yellow compared to overall units needed. Again, this is Kent County, but we're way underbuilding the amount of supply that we need in the marketplace. And so if our highest income earners are squeezing our middle income earners, then our middle income earners aren't leaving the housing market, they're then squeezing our low and moderate income earners. And so then what happens at the bottom of this, at the far left, is our lowest income earners are getting pushed out of the market, which means they double up, meaning you get 2 families to a home. Some of them are now living out of their cars, or they're deciding to travel an hour or an hour and a half to get to work. So we're seeing this everywhere, and eventually we're gonna run out of those places that you can commute to from an hour and a half away. And so this is where supply really gets part of the mix. We've gotta have enough supply at every price point, but we can't ignore the top end of the income strata because they're the folks, they're the 600-pound gorilla in the room. That's the group of folks who can kind of throw their money around and make whatever choices they want. So this graph now illustrates what you have to earn in the marketplace today to afford a new market rate apartment. So if you want a new one-bedroom apartment, the cost to build that is going to be roughly $150,000 to $200,000 for a 600 square foot apartment. The cost to build a two-bedroom apartment is going to be closer to $185,000 to $225,000. So in order to afford that, this is the wage that you've got to earn, and you can see who are our laborers in the market who are earning below that and who's earning above that. And this data, by the way, comes from Michigan Works. So as we start to think about, or as you all start to think about, how do you want to influence what's happening in the local marketplace relative to housing? I borrow this, you can see at the bottom, there's a guy named Shane Phillips, who's a professor of housing and urban studies, wrote a book called The Affordable City. It applies not just to cities, but counties and states as well. These are the three basic rules that we've got to be thinking about. How are we ensuring stability for our households who are at risk of housing instability? And that might be things like making sure we've got enough childcare in the community that is affordable. It might be making sure that transportation options are available. It might be making sure that the United Way has services and programs available to those households. Number two is supply. So once you feel like, okay, we've got our stability under control, we're doing some work around that to stabilize at-risk households, then you really focus on housing supply and think about how do we get enough housing supply at every price point, from low income to luxury, to ensure that the market has choices and that families of all incomes have options within the marketplace. And in order to do that, in order to get options at all price points, you're going to need some subsidies. That could be the form of federal tax credits, it could be state grants and loans, it could be local tax abatements. In all honesty, it's probably a combination of the three and then some. In a couple of slides down, you'll start to see where our gaps are and how much subsidy is needed in the marketplace under a business as usual approach. So part of what's important about this conversation is really understanding the dynamics of our local market. Every market is a little different. Everybody heard the phrase location, location, location as it relates to real estate. This is true anywhere we go, and it's true in housing. So downtown South Haven has a slightly different housing market than does the outer rim of the city of South Haven. And then the township has a slightly different market. They're all influencing each other. It's all part of a regional economic shed. But each neighborhood is doing something slightly different, and recognizing what's happening in each neighborhood is important. And so you can see the metrics that I normally look at when I come into a community. I want to think about how many households do we have, either growing or declining, as compared to population. Now what's important about this is we're going through a significant transformation in terms of the demographics in the United States right now. The two largest generations in the history of the United States are baby boomers and millennials. Baby boomers are entering retirement at a very fast clip, many of whom are deciding we're ready for a new housing option, right? The 3,500 square foot home in the suburbs in a great school district was great for 30 years. A lot of baby boomers have decided we don't need that much space anymore. The kids don't come home and stay with us. They're ready to sell off that large home and move into something smaller with less maintenance. But simultaneously, we have the largest generation in the history of the United States, millennials, who are now of age to buy their first home. But they don't have 30 years worth of equity that they've built up in order to afford a $450,000 house. In fact, they've got student loans, they've got credit card debt, they've got car payments. All of those things make it very difficult to buy a home that is high value. What they need is starter homes. And frankly, what has traditionally happened is young people, first-time home buyers, buy the old houses in the marketplace, right? My first house was 100 years old, built in 1910. I think we paid $117,000 for it in 2007. The worst possible year to buy a house, by the way, was 2007. We figured that out the hard way. But we bought an old house in an okay neighborhood because that's what we could afford. That was kind of the low end of the spectrum. But what's happened since the Great Recession is we've had a significant decline in new building starts. We haven't built nearly enough additional housing. And so now, as I mentioned earlier, we've got higher income folks who are also competing for that old housing because there isn't enough new supply coming online. Or and this is another really important factor, is the new supply coming online isn't in the location that higher income households want to be. What is also happening in the marketplace is roughly half of the housing market wants to be in a neighborhood that is close to amenities, where they can walk downtown, or they can walk to the beach, or they can walk to the park or the library or the school. And we don't have enough of those walkable and amenity-rich neighborhoods in any community in the state of Michigan. And so we've got both first-time home buyers and baby boomers with lots of equity to spend looking for housing in the same neighborhoods, competing for the same housing choices. And as a result, developers who are like, hey, we're building new houses way out here on the urban fringes, a lot of buyers are saying, yeah, but that's not really what we want. We want to be downtown. So we've got a mismatch between what's available in the market and what people actually want. The other important characteristic about the market right now, and this stems back to what's happening generationally, is roughly 2/3 of all households are either single adults or two adults with no kids at home. So while so often when we think about what kind of housing do we need, we think, well, we need single family homes and we need them on big lots so the kids have places to play. True, but only true for 1/3 of the population. The other 2/3 generally are much smaller households without kids at home who may want a single family home on a big lot, and kudos to them if they do. They may also say, I can't afford a single family home on a big lot. What I'd like is a 1-bedroom house or condo or townhouse or apartment. Or we'd like a 1-bedroom plus an office for the member of the family who's working from home. And what's happening in South Haven and in Van Buren County and across the state of Michigan is we don't have nearly enough of those studio 1- and 2-bedroom options, whether they're for sale or for rent, as compared to the number of 1- and 2-person households. So again, we have a mismatch in supply. Now this is interesting. This is unique. I don't see this kind of data in most communities I'm in. What you're looking at in red is the median home value from 2010 to 2020. In blue, if you can see the blue line, is the median family income. So you can see in about 2014, the median family income spikes. It starts to go up faster than the median home value. And when I first saw this, I was like, well, that's really interesting. What kind of jobs are showing up in South Haven that's causing that income to spike? And then when I started to dig into the data a little bit more, what I realized is more folks who were claiming their residence in another location have now begun to claim their primary residence here in South Haven or South Haven Township. So you've got higher income folks who may be coming from Chicago or Indianapolis or Detroit or Kalamazoo or Grand Rapids who previously had a second home here, and now they've changed their place of residence. And so their primary residence is here, and so their income shows up here. What's not happening, unfortunately, for a minute I was like, great, people are earning lots of money and it's gonna be able to allow us to build more housing at the right price points. I don't think, for the most part, that's what's happening. I think it's that primary residence issue. So in the meantime, the housing that is getting built in the region, I think this is in South Haven Township, this is an Allen Edwood neighborhood. This is the lowest price new construction I can find anywhere in Van Buren County right now, $373,000. This neighborhood goes up to about $450,000. Now there may be some independent builders who are building one-offs and they're able to get their prices down closer to $300,000. But I would guess you're not getting a lot of new housing supply in the $150,000 to $250,000 price range. We'll talk about that in a second. So now, based on this data, our average cost per square foot, $373,000 divided by 1,830 square feet. What we discover is our baseline cost of construction is about $200 per square foot. We need to assume going in that, I see somebody shaking their head. Is there better data than that? Okay. I thought, there's always a builder in the room who knows more than I do, and so I always want to make sure I'm checking myself. If we're assuming $200 per square foot, then we can start to do some math to calculate what can we actually build in the marketplace today. So let's start to think about that. In high growth markets, in markets where you have a lot of population coming in and lots of that population has a fair amount of money to spend, Those are good opportunities to build more density in the kinds of places people really want to be. So this is actually a picture from East Grand Rapids. This is close to the little downtown Gaslight Village. These were 2 single-family lots originally, and now it's 12 condominium units. Now the caveat here is these units are condos, and they sell for $550,000 to $850,000. So these are not affordable units. But here's what we have to remember. You remember the step-down effect? The folks who buy these condos otherwise would be buying single-family homes in this neighborhood and renovating them with $200,000 to $300,000 renovation budgets. So had these buildings not been built, all 12 of those families would have bought up the otherwise slightly more affordable homes in that neighborhood. So what we're doing here is accommodating more people so that we have less displacement occurring in the neighborhood. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better than saying, well, we don't want rich people housing, so we're gonna do nothing, because those wealthy people show up whether you do something or not. And if you do nothing, they show up and buy all of your existing housing stock and invest quite a bit of money into it. Now, for transitional markets, these are markets that I would, frankly, based on what I know, I would characterize South Haven and the surrounding township as a transitional market, where you're not high growth, you're not experiencing significant population growth, but what you are seeing is a change in demographics. You're seeing more seasonal homeowners enter the market, and you're seeing more retirees enter the market with more money to spend. And without enough supply to accommodate those higher income, either wage earners or retirees, they outcompete your lower income workforce and your middle class workforce, and that element of the workforce has to commute from farther and farther away. So there's a displacement effect happening in transitional markets. So again, there's an opportunity to build additional, more unique housing typologies. This is also a condo building. These units typically sell for between $180,000 and $325,000, depending on whether it's a 1-bedroom or a 3-bedroom. But this is, I think this is 10 units on what would normally be 3 single-family lots. Now, we also have revitalization markets, and I think you may have a neighborhood or 2 in the community that I would classify as a revitalization market, where you have somewhat of a high vacancy rate. So there are some neighborhoods in South Haven where we're seeing vacancy rates around 10%. I think that's skewed because of seasonal rentals, right? You probably have some seasonal rentals that are escalating that vacancy rate. But you've also got some older homes that may not be occupied and are not being utilized as seasonal rentals. And so in those markets, we employ different solutions, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Part of this is thinking about what are we allowing for in the marketplace. If we continue business as usual in terms of our zoning codes, most of what our communities allow for, 90% of our residentially zoned land is zoned for large lot single-family homes. Now, sometimes when you're zoning for multifamily, you can make up for that because you can get a lot of density in a relatively small area. But the other opportunity is to think about, what if we just narrow some of our standards? What if we allow our single-family lots to get a little bit narrower, so that instead of needing 10,000 square feet to build 1 home, we could use 10,000 square feet to build 2 homes, right? So you go from a 10,000 square foot lot minimum to a 5,000 square foot lot minimum. In markets where you have infrastructure, where you have sewer and water availability, that's a great solution. Now this one, these are townhouses side by side. You can probably get, I would guess, at least 4 townhomes on a 10,000 square foot lot and still have enough room for yards and parking and all of the rest. So when we start to do the math, when we say, okay, it costs about $200 a square foot to build a home, we also have to account for the cost of land and probably making a utility connection. And then there's some builder profit or commissioner broker profit. We're gonna assume bottom line cost is $225,000 to build a 1,000 square foot townhouse. But 1,000 square feet, remember, we can get at least 2 bedrooms, 2 baths in 1,000 square feet. That's a pretty decent size unit. That becomes affordable to a household earning $58,000 a year. Now, whether that's 2 incomes or 1 income doesn't matter to me. It matters to that family. But that's a rent of about $1,450 a month. Probably doesn't sound very affordable to you. And it's a mortgage of about $1,200 a month. So that assumes that this household that earns $58,000 a year is spending exactly 30% of their gross income on housing. I would prefer that everybody spends 20% of their income or less, but we're working with what we've got. So here's an example. This is not South Haven. This is, I think, the Okemos area, but I'm just illustrating a point here, so the location shouldn't matter too much. This is the actual lot dimension of see that corner parcel where the arterial road goes into the cul-de-sac? That corner is vacant. The reason that corner is vacant is the same reason that the corner lot on major arterials is always one of the last lots to sell, is because most people don't want to buy a house on a high traffic corridor, right? It's kind of the least desirable lot in the neighborhood because you've got to deal with the noise from the traffic. So these are the lot dimensions, 80 feet by 150 feet. We can easily put inside this box 3 townhouses instead of 1 single family home, if we're zoning for that. And so legitimately in this neighborhood, this lot was being sold for $75,000, which was about $50,000 less than the other lots because it was a less desirable lot. And so if we put 3 townhouses instead of 1 single family home on that lot, we drop from a single home at $375,000 to up to 3 homes at $285,000 each. Because we've reduced our land costs, because we've been able to reduce some of our infrastructure cost, we get economies of scale by building 3 units attached. We're also building 3 smaller units instead of 1 big unit. We get all kinds of savings baked in. Now, for those of you that like to shop at Costco, you are not getting more square feet. You are getting a worse deal when you think about how many dollars am I spending per square foot. This is a bad deal if you think in Costco terms. But when we think about housing, what we're not doing is buying housing in bulk, most of us. Not today anyway. What we're doing is thinking about what are the needs of my family and how do I serve those needs. So even though you're spending more on a per square foot basis for a smaller home, this gets you into a price point that is much more affordable than being forced to buy the traditional large lot single family house. Now, but this is where it gets even better. So what you're looking at here, this illustration, is actually a 4-plex. These are 4 condominium units, 2 over 2. On the left, there's a 2-bedroom, 2-bath. On the right, there's a 1-bedroom, 1-bath. These condo units can sell for between $165,000 and $250,000 each, based on construction costs. The house itself looks like a house, right? It doesn't need to look like that classic 4-plex that you might remember from the 1970s where it's all garages up front and a little bit of house behind. You can build these things really well if you bake in high quality design standards. Now, it takes time. You really want to trust your zoning consultant to make sure that you're getting the zoning standards right. But if you say, hey, as long as you build it the way we want it to look, we don't mind if it has 2 or 3 units in it. In fact, we prefer it in some instances, and we would love it if you made those units available for sale instead of for rent. Those are big opportunities. This is an example of a triplex. There's 3 homes. Each of those peaked gables is an individual unit, and each of those units is owner-occupied. Now, I think this is one of my last examples I'm going to share. We've got these kinds of properties all over the state of Michigan, where we have a high traffic corridor or arterial, and then we've got a strip mall on that corridor that functions fine, right? A lot of our strip malls don't have a high vacancy rate because they're relatively cheap buildings to maintain. But what this parcel that I've outlined is an old bank. It's had like 3 different banks in it over the last 10 years. Each one of the banks decides, we don't really need a physical location here anymore. Everybody's mobile banking today, right? How many people are banking on their phones instead of going into a branch most of the time? Me too. So this bank is vacant, and there's a great opportunity to put a little building on that site. 55 by 150, that 55-foot width standard is a classic standard for a double-loaded corridor apartment building. That means there's a hallway right down the middle, apartments on both sides. The apartments get lots of natural light. It's a really efficient way to service an apartment building. If you allow it to be 4 stories, it's 35 units. If you limit it to 3 stories, it's going to be something closer to 26, 28 units, depending on unit size. So we're taking what is essentially an abandoned commercial site, and reactivating it with exactly the kind of housing that our workforce needs in the local community. But what we've got to think about is, are we making it easy for a developer to do that today? And are we communicating to the developer that that's what we want? Or are we saying, well, they'll come to us and our processes don't really accommodate it today, but we'll figure it out? One of the things that's really important to understand, especially in the market today, is material costs are going up 10, 15, 20% every 90 days. The inflationary impact on the cost of construction is extraordinary right now. And if a developer comes to you and says, hey, I want to do this, and you say, yeah, well, maybe let's go through the process, what you're signaling to that developer is it might be 6 months before they get a building permit, or it might be 1.5 years before they get a building permit. The cost to build that building could go from $2 million to $3 million in the period of time that it takes him to get his permit. So really thinking about, and maybe this is not a building that you want to prioritize. And since I haven't shown you a pretty rendering, maybe you don't even know if you want to prioritize it. But these are opportunities, oh, there's the pretty rendering. These are opportunities to communicate to the market. Tell developers, what are you looking for? And then cater your zoning code to allow for the things that you're looking for and communicate that. Be externally communicative to developers about, these are the products we want, these are the price points we're trying to hit. Come to our community, we will facilitate the process as expeditiously as we can. Oh, so the important thing, I don't know if you all have this embedded in your codes, a lot of communities from 2005 to 2015, 2018, they started to embed standards where they required retail on the ground floor. They said, we want mixed-use buildings everywhere. And this is because, frankly, in the 80s and 90s, in early 2000s, we started to recognize that we had stopped investing in place, we had stopped investing in small-scale mom-and-pop businesses, and we didn't really have any places for the corner bakery anymore, or the local coffee shop. And we said, we want more coffee shops and bakeries. So we started to require that every developer bake in places for coffee shops and bakeries on the ground floor of apartment buildings. There's only so many coffee shops and bakeries that can serve one population. So we're victims of this in Grand Rapids. We required it on the ground floor of everything, and now our retail vacancy rate is like 40%, because we built all these buildings that are great apartment buildings, and they have vacant retail on the ground floor. So don't require that. So I've talked a little bit about this math already, but I want you to think about this relative to this building, but it also works for the nice, pretty brick one. If we're talking about construction costs, we're going to go over $200 a square foot for a smaller unit. So the most expensive things when you build housing are kitchens and bathrooms. The least expensive things are bedrooms and hallways, right? So a smaller unit has less bedrooms and hallways relative to the total square footage, more kitchens and bathrooms relative to the total square footage. So the cost per square foot goes up on a smaller unit. But we're still getting housing that is priced under $200,000 if it's for sale, or it's renting for about $1,000 a month. These are still big opportunities in our community if we're allowing for them in the right locations. Now, the other thing to think about, and this gets a little more nuanced, and here's where we have to start to get really careful and finicky, but these are big opportunities, is to start to think about, how do we allow our existing established neighborhoods to evolve? How does a neighborhood evolve to adapt to a changing demographic and a changing marketplace? So the top picture, what you're seeing, is a single-family house that was converted into a two-family house. You can see two front doors, one in the foreground and one in the rear. Now, in my opinion, getting the architecture right is critical. I think that part of the reason duplexes didn't work well in the 70s and 80s is because we designed them poorly. We put the garage out front, we made like 80 feet of driveway and asphalt along the road frontage, and they were ugly. And they communicated to the residents that this is not necessarily a place of dignity. This is a duplex that we're going to put on a high corridor arterial. And so it became a housing option of last resort. It was not a housing option that people sought out because it wasn't attractive and it wasn't dignified. But you can do this really well if you're careful about the architecture. And so again, it's about, how do we codify, how do we zone for these kinds of conversions but do it in a way where we very clearly articulate and express to both developers and architects that we have high standards, right? That we're not just gonna allow you to wall off the staircase or build a new staircase on the outside of the building, God forbid, and suddenly just create a new unit out of thin air. We want you to invest a little bit more money in that, and we want it to look good. We want it to look like it's always been there. The other option, the cottage community on the ground floor, is every community I go to, doesn't matter how urbanized it is, there are these random parcels where you've got a home on 2 or 3 acres, kind of in the middle of an urban neighborhood that's been served by water and sewer for years. And it's like, wow, how is this 2.5 acres still sitting here when you've got a housing shortage? It's like, well, you know, this family's been here forever, or that family had chickens and they wanted to let the chickens roam around. But those are parcels, if the owner is open to it and you decide to allow it in your zoning codes, you could add 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 little cottages on those parcels. Well designed. You want to make sure your fire department is happy about it. They've got to be able to access those units, pull the hose from the nearest fire hydrant. Those are all important things to consider. But you can embed those things in existing neighborhoods. We don't have to go all the way out to the hinterlands, although we can also do that there. And again, these smaller units are less expensive to build. More per square foot, but less per unit. Here's another example where we've got kind of a traditional neighborhood, houses close to the front. These households could decide, we're gonna build a secondary dwelling unit in the backyard, often referred to as accessory dwelling units. These are great if you have aging parents that say, no way you're putting me in a nursing home. I'm coming to live with you. And your response is, I'm not sharing a kitchen with my mother ever again. The accessory dwelling unit is your option, right? Same thing, adult kids who are like, you know what? I'm working on my master's degree. I can't afford rent plus everything else. And frankly, mom and dad, I don't want to live with you anymore either. Great option to have a guest house, an accessory dwelling unit in the back. But what we have to recognize is oftentimes the reason somebody builds these in the first place is for a family member or a loved one. But often what happens is 5 or 10 years down the road, the family member or loved one moves on, they go do something else, or the whole family moves and they sell. That accessory dwelling unit can then become a rental property. It can become an income-producing property. And it's important to recognize that that's not necessarily a bad thing. Having rental properties mixed into traditional single-family owner-occupied neighborhoods actually creates more stability. It creates more eyes on the street. It creates more opportunities. Very often what happens is the person who's renting one of those is saving their money so that one day they can buy a house in the same neighborhood. When we create mixed income neighborhoods with a diversity of housing choices, we're also creating ladders of economic opportunity for people, where they may move into an apartment as their first housing option. And eventually, if there's a townhouse in the neighborhood, that's their next option. They buy the townhouse. Ultimately, they want to build up enough equity that they can buy the big house, have kids, have the backyard, it's all great. And then when they retire, they do the whole thing in reverse, right? They go back to the townhouse and then they go back to the accessory dwelling unit. Creating those opportunities is not new. We did it really well pre-World War II. And then for some reason in the 50s and 60s, we started to decide that everybody needed their own patch of green. And it's not always necessary. So this is another example where you've got an existing single family house, nice and small and narrow. You just allow for them to add something on. It could be an accessory dwelling unit that's attached to the back. It could be a workshop or a home office that's attached to the side. You start to create little opportunities for entrepreneurship in neighborhoods, for craftsmen, for people who want to experiment and have their own little food kitchen. All kinds of stuff you can start to allow for if you're baking those into your zoning code. So here's an example. This is really, really rough math, but it gives you kind of a sense of what these things cost. So if you allow an existing homeowner to convert space that already exists, it's already finished, it's got plumbing, it's got electrical, it's got all the stuff, flooring, drywall. All they need to do is make sure there's a new kitchen and it's separated from the main unit and it's got access from the exterior. And again, you're imposing good architectural standards. You can probably do that kind of a renovation for 50 grand, hopefully a little bit less. So that equates, if you put on your investor hat, you want to pay off that 50 grand in 10 years or less. that means you want to charge a rent of between $500 and $800 a month. That's a pretty good rent if you're a renter. Now, the next most expensive option is to put an addition on the existing house. Again, a majority of the plumbing is already there, the electrical meter is already there, but you've got to add new square footage, meaning you pour a foundation, you're framing, drywall, all the rest. That's going to be closer to $100,000, maybe a little bit less than that. It's more expensive, so your rent is between $800 and $1,200 a month. Not super affordable, but probably better than brand new apartments in the community that are getting built now. Now the last one, a detached accessory dwelling unit, is the most expensive option. Typically at least $100,000, and that assumes that it's pretty small. We're talking 350, 400 square feet. If you're going to build a full-size kind of one-bedroom unit in the backyard at 650, 700 square feet, it's going to be more like $150,000 to build that. So now we're looking at $1,200 a month rent and up, which not affordable to everybody. A lot of our workforce would balk at that rental amount. But a lot of folks would say, wait a second, I get to live in the most stable neighborhood in the community. My kids can walk to school from here, or I can walk to school because I'm a public school teacher, and the rent is still comparable to living in a big multi-unit building. Take it, right? Recognize that there are people who want that option. Also recognize that it's probably only 1% to 2% of homeowners who are actually going to use this, especially if there are some restrictions on how those units can be utilized. All right, I think I'm going to wrap up here. So the last thing that I want to stress is what happens to your local tax base when you start to build in this kind of housing choice and diversity. We're looking at the same 18-acre parcel of land in option 1 on the top and option 2 on the bottom. On top, we're getting 38 new single-family homes on roughly 10,000 square foot lots. Our average price is $425,000. Our lowest price for a one-bedroom, two-bath is $350,000. We get a new taxable value of about $8 million out of that investment. And we might get like 16 kids in the school district, so hooray for the schools, we get more per pupil funding. And then the last thing, there's about 2,000 square feet of road and infrastructure per dwelling unit. Now, if we look at the next one below, what we're looking at is we still have some large lot, single-family lots, but we also have townhouses and attached condominiums, and we've even baked in a central green and then several little parks around the periphery. In that one, we've got 146 new homes in a combination of different housing types, single-family townhomes and apartments. Our average price is $325,000, but our low has gotten down to $185,000. And simultaneously, our new taxable value is almost $24 million. So we've tripled our taxable value while providing significantly more housing for the community. We've almost doubled, or we've more than doubled the total number of students, and we've reduced the amount of infrastructure on a per unit basis. So as you think about, as municipal officials, how are we going to maintain the infrastructure for these developments? The more housing units you have per linear foot of infrastructure, the easier it is to pay for that infrastructure over time. And frankly, the easier it is for our schools to thrive because we've got the potential for more kids in the neighborhoods. So there's a financial case to be made for this in addition to how do we provide enough housing supply for our workforce. Now, what I'm really excited about what you all are doing here today is your collaboration. I often am preaching to communities that you've got to collaborate because if only the core community, if only the local urban municipality says, we're going to solve housing, and all of the communities around it say, good luck with that, it gets super hard, right? Because our housing market is regional, people move all the time. If only one community is working on the issue, they've got to pull weight for everybody. And so if we're creating fairness across places, if we're providing for different types of housing choices in neighborhoods across the region, it doesn't mean you take a one-size-fits-all approach. It doesn't mean that you should build 150 units on 10 acres out in the middle of the township. I would not advocate for that. But it does mean that you can provide for more diversity in a lot of different neighborhoods. So quickly, I've done this math in a few different ways. The state of Michigan estimates that we need about 150,000 additional homes priced at $250,000 or below in just the next 5 years. Now, as we've been talking, it costs today roughly $350,000 to build a traditional single-family home under our modern zoning standards, right? Individual lot, individual house, 1,500 to 2,000 square feet. So there's a gap. There's an $80,000 to $100,000 gap between what it costs to build the product we need under kind of a business as usual approach and what we actually need in terms of price point. So at the bottom, what we now know is we need $12 billion worth of subsidies to solve our housing problem in Michigan today if we do nothing in terms of how we're regulating for housing. So there's a financial imperative here too, because the housing isn't just gonna figure itself out if we do nothing. So going forward, my hope is that you all talk to each other and start to think about, of all of the crazy ideas that I shared tonight, are there 2 or maybe 3 that you say, well, we could maybe pursue that. Let's think about it. And if you do, this is the list of tools, among others. Somebody brought up earlier, I think it was Mayor Smith, brought up the idea of community land trusts. We've got 2 community land trust projects working a little north of here right now. We'd be happy to talk more about that. Also happy to talk about all of the state and federal and local programs that are available to help support costs. Because remember, I talked earlier about the importance of stability, supply, and subsidy all working together. Our goal is to not have to subsidize too many units. So the more we can allow for the market to do its thing on its own, the better. But we also have to recognize that some households are gonna need subsidy in order to get them into housing. I think this is my last one. Yep. So the recipe for regional collaboration, as I would suggest it to you, is first, can you identify some shared goals with measurable outcomes? Now, what's important to recognize is all of your goals will not be shared. The townships will have different ideas about certain things, and the city will have other ideas, and that's all fine, right? Find the things that you agree on, define what that is, and then decide how are you gonna measure whether you're succeeding or not. The second most important thing about that is just being honest and transparent about the barriers that you run into. Some things you try will not work, and there will be all kinds of reasons why they won't work. I can tell you, we had a great housing development that everybody thought was supported north of Grand Rapids, and it turned out that the village clerk's brother lived in a property adjacent to the development site, and he didn't want that development to occur, and there were all kinds of politics that happened and the deal fell apart, right? And so people were mad at each other and they didn't want to work together anymore and they couldn't believe any of it happened. But that's what happens, right? It's people. Unfortunately, we're messy. And if we're just honest and transparent about, yep, it fell apart, these are all the reasons, let's try something else. You're way better off than pointing fingers and getting mad and huffing off in a storm. So then the last part is committing to work together despite those setbacks. This is like a marriage, right? You're not committing on all fronts, you're committing on 1 or 2 shared goals. And then you're gonna say, I swear, we're gonna keep working on this until we get it right. And if you can do those 3 things, I promise that you will have success. So I think with that, we'll take some questions.
Before you state your question, a couple things. We will be sharing this presentation online. So if you've got little snaps on your phone, we will have that presentation. And then as we take questions, we'll keep you to about 2 minutes if you can. But if you can, just state your name and where you live. Just city or township. Thanks.
Ryan, I think it's on. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, Ryan Servetus, Southampton resident. I like the numbers you just said. We are 150,000 units we need in 5 years. And you gave that for the state.
Yeah.
Is there a breakdown we can get for like Van Buren County or even a city and township area?
Yeah, so we will often conduct a housing needs assessment for communities that we work in. That's a process we could go through to figure out like exactly what do we think your number is. We can also sort of guesstimate it. I would assume for South Haven, I mean, this is a super rough guesstimate, but I would kind of put the number in the range of 800 to 1,000 units over the next 5 years. We'd want to do a lot of work to see how close I am to being right about that number. But yeah, I would say you don't have to worry about tens of thousands of units. You probably don't have to worry about thousands. You're probably in the ballpark of hundreds.
And is there any allocation of funds from the state or feds to help out with that shortfall?
Yeah. Yeah, so traditionally, there's been a tax credit program for rental units. There's a down payment assistance program for ownership units. And now we have the Federal American Rescue Plan Act, which pushed $4 or $5 billion into the state of Michigan. And the governor and the legislature are working out a plan right now to try to figure out how do those dollars get spent. We anticipate something on the order of $500 million will go to housing in some form or another, and they're still kind of wrangling over what kinds of housing and how do we prioritize it. We do know they have committed that 30% of those dollars will go to rural communities, and South Haven Township qualify. They're also talking about missing middle as being a big priority, so we would expect somewhere between 50 million and 200 million will go to missing middle. But what's important is every community in the state recognizes they have some kind of housing issue. And it's the communities that have projects that they're kind of ready to move on that are going to get funded first. And it may be, I think the jury is still out, whether or not the state can move that much money that quickly. If they can, then the projects that are ready to go will get funded. If the state struggles with bureaucracy to get those dollars moving, we may have longer to kind of catch up and get projects ready.
I'm Annie Brown. I live in the city of South Haven. I'm running for state representative because affordable housing is one of my top priorities. I have several questions, but I'm going to be quick.
Okay.
I'm interested in inclusionary zoning programs, and will those bring in more federal funding?
So let me unpack inclusionary zoning, because there's two ways to talk about it. A lot of housing advocates talk about inclusionary zoning as saying, if you're going to build an apartment building, you have to make 30% of those units affordable. That's kind of the classic version of inclusionary zoning. That's a super hard thing to do in reality unless there is a subsidy, right? So right now, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration have all said that they want to support zoning reform at the local level. The Biden administration has now started to tie some dollars to that. They're not committed yet, but they're starting to say, yes, we'll put some money into zoning reform. If there are dollars that come with the inclusionary zoning requirement, it could work well. But so far, we don't have any federal commitments that would make that happen. And oftentimes what we see, we've seen this happen in markets on the West Coast as well as the East Coast. If you mandate inclusionary zoning, meaning you say you have to make a certain share of your units affordable, oftentimes developers just don't build because they can't make the math work on the affordable units. They're not earning enough profit to justify the subsidy, which is unfortunate, but it turns out to be the case.
And my other question is, we had some 600-pound gorillas coming to all the city council and planning commission meetings complaining about the Overton project. And how can we change that as we turn our gaze to the township and prevent that from happening again? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to interpret that as we've got folks with a vested interest in the neighborhood who aren't super happy about more density or housing choices for folks who might be a little bit different, which is understandable in some instances. Part of this is recognizing that what I'm talking about here is a change from the status quo. And a lot of us, depending on our circumstances, resist change from the status. If the status quo benefits me, I don't really want it to change. And so part of the solution here is having conversations in a non-public setting. And I think this gets philosophical, but I'm going to wax for just a minute. Part of our obligation as citizens, as members of the community, is to have those hard dinner table conversations with friends with different opinions than we have. I think so much of our politics has gotten polarized because we stopped having those hard conversations. And I think our obligation as residents of the community is to seek out those people with different opinions, especially on stuff like this that frankly to me is easier than national politics. To be able to say, okay, you know, why do you resist it? What don't you like about it? Or what do you like about it? And what's important to you? And again, find where you have common ground and really think through what do we want to achieve at the end of the day? And does the project actually threaten that, or does it threaten my sense of security? And I can't answer that for any individual, but I think what's important is that we're pushing each other to really think through those things collectively, so that when we do get to a public hearing, we're not in a position where we don't feel like we've been heard and our only option is to kind of shout into the microphone for 3 to 5 minutes and then walk away feeling like we still haven't been heard. It's really finding different opportunities to hear each other and understand our differences and commit that we're going to figure out a way through them. Which I'm sorry it's not like a good answer, but that's my answer.
Mary Hasley, City of Kalamazoo, City of South Haven. So I've been listening to several MISTA presentations, and Mr. Chad Benson was talking about the state ARP budget, and he said that was $50 million for workforce housing, and that it was going to require a 501c3. It couldn't be to nonprofit. They're still trying to figure out whether there could be a joint venture between a nonprofit and a profit, but that's still under the works. They don't know if it will have similar criteria as LIHTC housing. There's just a lot of unknowns right now, but the legislation is pretty clear that it does have to have 501c3 nonprofits involved. So in that respect, and they also clarified that workforce housing really is typically, they said it was 185 to 300% federal poverty level, but that is above the 60% AMI. So I think it falls into the 80 to 120% AMI for workforce housing and middle housing type that we've been discussing. And so with that, you know, density, I was very pleased to see the density in the one diagram that you showed with 144 homes, which was about the same as Overton, but that was on 18 acres versus the 5 point whatever acres for Overton. So, you know, you're really talking apples and oranges, and, you know, one of your last points was transparency and honesty. So as we go forward, I certainly hope that that does ring true. And towards that end, especially with subsidies, I know from my own investigation and also just the seminars that I've been listening to that MISTA held on May 3rd and May 4th, like LIHTC housing, 9% versus 4%. So 9% is very competitive, it's not guaranteed. 4% is given, I mean, it's subsidized with bonds, so that's there. There's really not much delay. It's really different processes for 9% and 4%, correct?
Yep, correct.
Okay. And so as we go forward, I certainly hope that the points that were made in this discussion are continued to be made. And with regard to zoning, you know, if waivers are required, I certainly hope that those are clearly stated, because it is a give and take. And if, you know, corner lots are not assigned a rear lot because it's a corner lot for one development, but it is assigned for other developments, then there's favoritism. So anything you can say about that would be appreciated.
I think I agree on the 4%, 9% difference, absolutely. I think all of the zoning that specifically relates to Overton, I haven't had a chance to be involved in, so I wouldn't be the right person to comment on how the process went or what occurred. It is important to note, I think the 4%, 9% conversation is worth talking about for a second. So I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible for people who frankly don't care as much as I do about it. The 9% program is what equates to a 9% tax credit. It's 9% of the value of the project that is given to the project every year for 10 years, generally. So at the end of the day, the developer receives 90% of their project costs as a subsidy from the federal government. The 4% is the same thing, except it's 4% per year every year for 10 years. So they receive a 40% subsidy for the entire project cost. So the reason the 4% is non-competitive is because so many developers can't make the math work with just the 4% credit, because it's only 40% of the total development cost. Now, lots of developers can make the math work. It is a very useful tool, and we've been leaning on MISTA to change some of their lending standards. Part of what makes it difficult is MISTA's tax-exempt bond financing rules. So there are some workarounds that we're trying to get more 4% deals done, especially in West Michigan. And I think the point that you make is an important one. There are opportunities to get those easy wins if we can massage the financing and we can find the right site. The 4% is a good way to get more rental units in the community without having to compete with the entire state for the 9% tax credit. So hopefully there's a little bit of a level playing field in terms of all of our understanding of what the difference is between those two things. But I think it's a good point. Yeah.
Remind me of something. So this is something, and I'm sure you saw up and down the shoreline of other lake communities, Saugatuck, Holland. You got a lot of buildings that are 2 or 3 stories with old apartments that haven't been used in probably decades. Is there any funding or anything you're seeing through other things that the state can help break those up to normal so they can rent it? And also, if they can be rented, what are you seeing that's going to happen with parking? Because we already tight parking in South Haven. Saugatuck's dark parking. What are you seeing other communities do to fix that up? And how are they getting funding for that?
Yeah. So the answer to the first question is yes. It's called the Rental Rehab Program. It's available through the Michigan Economic Development Corporation in the form of a community development block grant. So that's a bunch of jargon I just threw at you that I'm happy to talk about afterwards. It's a grant program that can fund up to 50% of the cost of the rehab for upstairs apartment units that are currently vacant. Oftentimes they want to see the buildings functionally obsolete, which as long as your local assessor is on board, we can certify. So you could get $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 per apartment unit to rehab those and bring them back online. So if you've got those vacant spots in the community, absolutely, I would recommend pursuing those dollars. In terms of parking, what we've seen some of the most creative options is to think about that seasonal crowd and serve them really well with some form of free transit. So think about, where do you have a parking lot on the periphery of downtown where it still feels like, oh, this is a great place to park, I'm happy about it. And can we easily get them to the core of downtown or to the waterfront via a trolley or, think about ride hailing now, Uber, Lyft, those kinds of things. Sometimes if you don't have Uber and Lyft in your market, you've got volunteers who are retirees who are like, sure, I'll come drive people around for 4 hours, I'm happy to. My dad actually is one of those people who likes to volunteer for that kind of thing. So thinking about what creative resources do you have where you've probably got property that's 5, 6, 7 blocks outside of downtown where a lot of people don't park. If you can secure that property with a seasonal lease or even buy it and make that property available and sign it well so that as people are coming in, you can say, hey, if you can't find parking downtown, go to this lot and somebody will come text this number and they'll be there in 5 minutes. Those are great solutions to what is typically a 3 or 4 month parking problem.
Mike Neese, city resident, I can actually say neighborhood resident, about 2 blocks from here. Ryan, I want to talk to you about how we can utilize you more and better moving forward. Zoning changes are going to have to occur. There's no doubt. We have a great planning commission, dedicated people. You know, I always tease people, you know, if you want some good reading material, join the planning commission. You can count on a 180-page packet every week or every month. But there are things we don't know, and we don't know that we don't know them. That based on the presentation, we're going to have to look at some things. And looking through some of your past projects, things like, I do have someone that's interested in purchasing a piece of property that's in one of our, I'll call it one of our rundown commercial districts.
Sure.
But he wants to put some residential housing in there.
Yep.
And currently it's zoned for business. Now we can get around that. The city's always working, but you've got something called the UDO that you were able to come up with, the Unified Development Ordinance. We don't know that those things exist. That's the kind of stuff I'd look for. There are residential zoning codes called low-density zones. When you talk about accessory dwelling units, they're usually in the low-density zones, which are usually 3 homes per acre. So It takes that into account. That's stuff we don't know either. The second thing that I want to use you more for, I'm thrilled that you're not only a housing authority, but you've also been an economic director, and you're a community director. I say those things can't be separated. There is, people get tired of me saying it, planning is a chess game, it's not a checkers game. And it's very much connected to each of those things. So we need some help and guidance on how those fit together. How do we do it and still maintain our community character? How do we do it and still ensure an economic path? And most importantly, how do we do ordinances and do planning so that that change becomes the path of the least resistance, not the most resistance? We get out in front of it and get the white spaces taken care of. I also want to repeat what Ryan said. We need help. County data to me doesn't help me much. Michigan data doesn't help me much. Now, I know we both play a consultant game, and all of our clients say, we're unique, we're unique, we're unique, when actually there's more in common. But I do think there's some uniqueness when you look at our data. When you look at our wage data, from what I've seen, we have the lowest wages in Van Buren County and the highest cost of living. That's different. That's different. There are things like that separate us from that pool of data. One thing you said in one of our last meetings I didn't see addressed there, which I think is one of your great talents in the things you've done, and that's the public-private connection. I love what you did in Holland. If you could please send the ICCF down to help us, we'd appreciate it. What an amazing thing that we don't always have to count on the federal government or the state. There are people out there to help, and the ICCF buying those 177 properties from that Chicago investor, that's pretty darn cool. We need help finding those kind of people as well. And lastly, again, I think you can provide an objective point of view. People are dancing around it, but whether it's Overton, whether it's other things, the issue we're going to run into in South Haven, we're a very small piece of property. It's going to be density. And that density in our neighborhoods has to be measured in July, not November. Because we don't have single-family homes. There's not one or two people in homes. There could be 6 to 8 people in those homes. And that's a whole different density picture than what the norm and the common wisdom of the state might have.
Sure.
So, again, I don't have the checkbook for the city, but those are just a few of the things I'd be looking for some help as we think about this further.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You guys are a relatively easy crowd. Nobody's throwing anything at me. Kate's not throwing anything at me. Well, I don't know, did Kate or Mayor Smith, did you guys want to wrap up, or? Yeah?
If there's no more questions, I guess we'll just wrap this up. I know it's a bit warm in here, so thank you, everybody, for bearing with us today. Again, this recording, as well as the presentation, will be on the city's website. Again, we wanted to start this as a community conversation to find out where we want to go next. So with that, we'll kind of hear from you and kind of see what our next steps are. If there's nothing else, thank you all for coming, and we are adjourned here at 7:23.